In heavenly armor we'll enter the land. The battle belongs to the Lord. No weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord.
When you think about the Bible character Saul, king of Israel, the one term that generally comes to mind is evil. When we think of Saul, king of Israel, we think of somebody who's bad, somebody who's malevolent, somebody who's always suspicious about everything, somebody who's always jealous, somebody who's carnal, somebody who's just beyond insane to try and keep their status in life. And I think some of those terms, I think some of those applications are pretty well deserved. I think Saul kind of fits the bill in a whole lot of those attributions. But I would like to argue this morning that Saul is not only not as bad as we think, gasp, but that in some ways we're much more like him than we sometimes give him credit for. When we think about Saul, we think about bad, we think evil, we think wicked, we think somebody who pursued David. And likewise, when we think about David, we think of somebody who was just radiant with life, and somebody who was hope-filled, and someone who was loving, somebody who was compassionate, and somebody who did God's will literally in every single aspect of life. And as we're going to get towards the end of this, I think there's some reason why we make those two comparisons, and why we generally look at one in one way and look at the other one the other way. But I think oftentimes what that does is cloud our opinion of who Saul is. Saul is the first king of Israel, probably the first one, obviously after the period of the judges. He's somebody who commands enormous respect, somebody who commands enormous love. But he also was a very complex figure. And that's something that only when you really start to look into the character of Saul, you start to see his personality, the things that he said, the things that he did. That's the part of Saul that really kind of becomes unraveled. He's very much like an onion. The more you peel of him, the more you see, the more layers there are, the more it stinks, obviously, in some levels. But he's a very complex figure. He's a very interesting person. That's the person that I would like to discuss about this morning. But do this in order to look at the Saul, in order to look at the character of Saul, though, I think it's important to kind of look at it the way that the Bible looks at it, which as a king. Whenever you look at the character of Saul, there's no denying the fact that the Bible typifies him as the first king of Israel. That's his station, that's his character attributes. And so in my opinion, that's the best way to kind of look at him, is look at him through the different phases of who Saul was as a king, and kind of see his transformation from point A to point B. The very first period of his life, though, was the period before he was a king. I think what's most interesting about who Saul is that Saul really didn't want to be king. If you look at 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, this is where we're going to begin this morning. If you look at 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, you'll notice the genesis of what made Saul Saul. In a lot of ways and in a lot of reasons, Saul should have never had any part of the scripture. He should have never played a real big role, albeit from being somebody who hopefully was halfway decent. But Saul was thrust into the limelight not because of his own doing. He really didn't even want to be king in the first place. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 1, there's a couple of reasons why Saul is thrust into the spotlight. And it begins here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 1. It says, "It came about when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel," as every father likes to do. "Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however," verse 3, "did not walk in all his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and took bribes and perverted justice." Everything, by the way, the prophets would decry about these people later. Verse 4, "Then the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you have grown old, your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." Verse 6, "But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel then prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they have said to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds," verse 8, "which they have done since the day that I brought them out from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." In other words, this is a taste of your own medicine, or my own medicine. Verse 9, "Now then listen to their voice, however you shall solemnly warn them, and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." 1 Samuel chapter 8 lists a whole bunch of reasons why the people describe and why they want a king in the first place. But the very first one that's listed is the one that's mentioned in the first two verses. It's kind of alluded to in that, and then capitalized in verses 3 down to verse 5. And the reason has absolutely nothing to do with Saul in any way, shape, and form. It's the fact that the people looked at Samuel's sons, two of which that are mentioned by name that he appointed as judges over Israel, that were absolutely morally bankrupt. And being in these leaders and leading these spiritual positions of leadership, these were people that would have been commanded enormous respect, would have commanded enormous authority. And the elders rise up towards Samuel, and they say to Samuel, your sons, these ones that you've appointed as judges over us, they're no good. They're wicked. They take bribes. They pervert justice. The one thing that they should be excelling in, which is justice, they're not even doing that very well. And so instead of having these people rule over us, give us a king that will judge us. That's the key phrase, that will judge us like all the nations. In other words, we don't want these people. We want to choose somebody. Somebody that the rest of the world accepts. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 8 closes, you have this whole discussion where Samuel is talking with the people of Israel about what a king will expect. What he will do to you, what he will do for you, but mostly how he will use his authority for his own, in a lot of ways, personal gain. And he makes this known to this people before they even begin. When you flip the script into chapter 9, 1 Samuel chapter 9, you see Saul presented in a very interesting light. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 9, starting in verse 1. It says, now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, the son of a Benjamite, a mighty man of valor. He had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. That's the one thing that me and Saul have in common, by the way. From his shoulders up, he was taller than any of the people. Saul is depicted in the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 9 as being, and this is in my opinion, very deliberate. And this is something as you peel back 1 Samuel, you'll notice within every chapter. But Saul is presented within the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 9 as being the anti-David in a whole lot of ways. Because everything that David was not, Saul was. Saul was tall. Saul taller than everybody else in the land. David was not. He was ruddy. He was good looking. But if you mention and look at 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 2, twice it's mentioned that Saul was handsome, more handsome than any other person in the world. It's just a curse that sometimes we have to bear. Saul was also a powerful warrior. David was not known for being that, even though he would testify later to Saul of his own accolades within battles with animals and battles in different arenas. He would accolade himself as being a warrior, but at that point he was not. And it's worth pointing out too that Saul not only comes from the tribe of Benjamin, which would play a huge role in the New Testament when the apostle known as Paul would come from the tribe of Benjamin, but that from the tribe of Benjamin came the most valiant warriors. The tribe of Benjamin was not super big, was not very large, was not a very huge tribe, but it was the one that possessed most of the warriors. This was the tribe from whom those sling bearers came from, that they could throw a sling and they would literally hit it, would not even miss within a hair. This was the tribe that all the valiant warriors came out of within Israel. And so the way that 1 Samuel chapter 9, the first few verses depict Saul is as being this valiant warrior, being the prototypical king. But in very unkingly fashion, he doesn't really depict a whole lot of these things. Because in verses 5 through 7, as he is anointed by Saul, or anointed by Samuel rather, the very first scene that we see of him is him being quite shy. Starting verse 5, it says, when they came to the land of Ziph, Saul said to a servant who was with them, come, let us return, or else my father will cease to be concerned about the donkeys and will become anxious for us. Saul is concerned that his father will be concerned because he's not home on time. Point that out about Saul's personality as being a very interesting and unique part about this. Verse 6, he said to him, behold, now there is a man of God in this city, as we're looking for sheep. The man has held an altar, and all that he says surely comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us about our journey on which we have set out. Verse 7, then Saul said to his servant, but behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is gone from our sack. There is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have? The servant answered Saul and said, behold, I have in my hand a fourth of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God, and he will tell us this way. As you read chapter 9 and you go throughout chapter 10, you see that the man of God that Saul is eventually going to meet to inquire about the location of his flock is Samuel. And Samuel wants to meet Saul. Samuel wants to talk to Saul because he has been told that Saul is the one that is going to become king. And so when Saul shows up at his doorstep and wants to inquire about his sheep, Samuel flips the script a little bit on him and ends up anointing him as king. But as you look throughout the later part of chapter 10, Saul is so, I don't know what the word is for it, but he's so humble about it that when he eventually comes back later with the sheep, and his parents and his uncle ask him, where have you been? He doesn't mention the fact that he was anointed king of Israel. And that's one of the more perplexing things about Saul, given that later in life, the only thing that seems to matter about Saul is his ego. And yet at this point in time, after he's anointed king of Israel, and he comes back and his uncle says, hey, how'd the sheep finding go? He says, oh, we found the sheep, that's great. He goes to his room, plays video games, and never mentions the fact that he was anointed king. That would be number one on my list. And yet Saul has this character and this personality at this point, whether it's shy, whether it's humility, that he just fails to bring this up. Manifests itself later in chapter 10 starting in verse 17, when you have the very public announcement, or very public dedication, or rather public dedication of Saul as the king, to kind of contrast with the private one that happened earlier. And in 1 Samuel chapter 10, starting in verse 17, it says, Thereafter Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the sons of Israel, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians, from the power of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But you have today rejected your God, who delivers you from all your calamities and your distresses, and you have said no, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by the tribes and by your clans. I love that God points this out before he selects the king. Because what he wants them to know about all this situation is that even though you've chosen a king for yourself, I'm the one that put you in this position right now. You may have selected a king, you may have demanded a king, but the only reason you're here right now and even talking to me in the first place is because of what I've done for you. And the only reason that you're getting a king, God says, is because I'm allowing it. Verse 20, Thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near. The tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families. The Matrite family was taken. Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he couldn't be found. Why? Probably for the same reason he failed to mention to his uncle that he had been anointed king over Israel. Verse 22, Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, Has the man come here yet? The Lord said, Behold, he is hiding himself by the baggage. So they ran and took him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. In other words, he stands out in the crowd. Verse 24, Samuel said to all the people, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, Long live the king. I want you to put in your minds real quick the scene that's unfolding before you. Because as these people are demanding a king that will serve them, that will rule over them, the person that is chosen has not on once but on two occasions displayed the fact that he really doesn't want to be king in the first place. That when Samuel tells him and anoints him, he comes back, he fails to mention it to his uncle, but then also whenever the whole big processional comes, hey, if everybody present, let's find us a king. Samuel knows, or Saul knows what's going on, and he's hiding out in the luggage train. He doesn't want to be there. And try as he might, as Saul in this early stage of his life is trying desperately not to be seen as this king-like figure, he's the one that's thrust into the forefront. I think what we learn about this situation, we learn especially about ourselves, about Saul in this situation, is that oftentimes God is ready for us before we are, quote, ready for him. I put ready in quotation marks. Because I think when we look at our situations in life, we're oftentimes far before we think we are. There's the phrase I'm looking for. Ready or farther before we think we are. That's the word I was going to say. We're ready or far before we think we actually are. I'm just going to move on to the next sentence I was going to say. But you think about people in this life that say to themselves, I don't want to become a Christian yet because of X, Y, and Z. And you hear this from different types of people for whatever type of reason. You say, well, how come you're not a Christian? You know what the Bible says about this. How come you're not a Christian? And inevitably what these people will say is, well, I just don't feel like I know enough yet. In reality, they knew enough a long time ago. But for whatever reason, they don't think that they're ready at this point in time to make that type of commitment. And the Ethiopian eunuch shoots that idea straight out the window. Because the Ethiopian eunuch was somebody who was hearing the word of God within a chariot distance. And understands enough within the chariot distance from town to town of what it takes to become a child of God and makes that decision. The reason that most people are not children of God, at least when they say they're not ready, has nothing to do with the fact that they're not ready, and everything with the fact that they're not quite prepared mentally as much as they should be. Maybe they just don't want to take that leap. They don't want to accept that responsibility. They don't want to make that jump just yet. God was ready for Saul long before Saul was ready for him. And like it or not, Saul is thrust into this instance. And at the very beginning of Saul's kingship, right when he was this young king, I would argue that Saul excels. One of the most neglected periods of Saul's life in the book of Samuel is this early stage in Saul's kingship, where he enjoyed almost unanimous success and love and adoration from literally every single person in the kingdom. And it's something that's only matched by David later in life. As David would erupt on the scene in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 17, and he just explodes onto the Israeli conscience. All these people are looking at David and they love him. We oftentimes forget that Saul commanded just as much love early in his reign as he did. Look at 1 Samuel, the 11th chapter. Keep in mind that what Saul is commanding at this point in his tenure is not a nation at all. It's very much like what George Washington inherited, which can best be described as a mess. And what Saul is now the king of is not this sweeping empire with thrones and with kingdoms and with all this respect and these huge robes and all these different things. Saul's most likely the head of a loose confederation of tribes that don't really like each other a whole lot, that don't really want to work together a whole lot either. And so what Saul's big task here is in the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 11 is not just to be a king, but to be a unifier. And his first instance that he gets to do this is in 1 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash," which by the way, Jabesh-Gilead would come into play later in Saul's life. We don't have time to talk about that. "But all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you.' Nahash the Ammonite said to them, 'I will make it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel.'" What's happening in these first two verses is one person or one group is besieging a town, and the town is saying, "Give us some kind of conditions for surrender." The conditions for the surrender from the people besieging is, "You can be our slaves. If we pluck your eye out, every last one of you, then we'll let you all go with your lives." That's the conditions, and that's the stalemate at this point in time. Verse 3, "The elders of Jabesh said to him, 'Let us alone for 7 days, that we can send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. If there is no one to deliver us, then we will come over to you.' The messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept." This situation in Saul's newly formed kingdom reaches the young king's ears. And verse 5 or verse 4, his response is well known. In verse 5, "Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, 'What is the matter with the people that they weep?' They related him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came mightily upon Saul when he heard these words. And he became very angry." You know where you see that phrase oftentimes used, the Spirit of God coming mightily upon somebody? Upon David. And yet here in 1 Samuel chapter 11, you have this thrown upon Saul at this point, very angry about the situation of his countrymen. Verse 7, "He takes a yoke of oxen, cuts them in pieces, sends them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of the messenger, saying, 'Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so it shall be done to this oxen.'" Saul's first act of unifying kingship within the newly formed Israel kingdom is to unite the clans in protection of a tiny city on the other side of the country. And he says, "Whoever doesn't rise up to protect this land, I'm going to come to your town, I'm going to do the same to you that I did to this oxen." Verse 8, "He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel that arose with them were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. That's the response that Saul had this early in his kingship. We oftentimes neglect the fact that this early in Saul's kingship, he wasn't some self-absorbed, maniacal, egotistical maniac. And I know I used the word maniac twice. That's for emphasis. But he wasn't some self-absorbed egomaniac. He was somebody who loved his countrymen so much and wanted to unify them so much that he sent a very declarative message towards all these people. If you don't come and protect these people, I'm going to come to your kingdom, I'm going to do the same thing to you. It's almost a polar opposite from what you see as the shine, the early side of him. When you look at 1 Samuel chapter 11, verses 12 and 13, then, after this victory where they free these people from their bondage. Verse 12, "Then the people said to Samuel, 'Who is he?' So, who is he that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring them in that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel." After Saul has delivered these people from their bondage, there arose a group of people that were very loyal to Saul, and they said, "We want to find out the people that were not loyal to Saul. All the people that asked the question, why is Saul here in the first place? Why is Saul reigning over us? Bring those people out, and let's put them to death." And very interesting in the life of Saul is he shows remarkable compassion, at least in this instance. He takes these men and he tells them, "Don't you touch one hair on their head." He shows extraordinary compassion to the people who hated him, who did not want him to be king. When you see the script flipped later in life, as David is trying to usurp, or David is supposed to eventually take the throne from Saul, Saul is enraged with jealousy and commits genocide on a whole bunch of different levels, purely because he wants to allocate power for himself. And yet at this early stage in Saul's reign, the people that are against him, his supporters, want to kill. Saul says, "Stay your hand, don't hurt those people." And he shows compassion while he does this. Saul characterizes himself through this early stages of his life as being somebody who's a fantastic warrior, but most importantly as a fantastic leader. And that's the part of Saul that gets lost in the shuffle when we talk about him with David, and him with Goliath, and him in the caves. That's the part of Saul that gets lost in the whole shuffle. When you look later in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 2, you see that he has 600 people fighting alongside him. When you see in verse 52 of 1 Samuel chapter 14, you see that he finds the valued and the virtuous men, and the valiant men rather, and he attaches them to himself. And as a result, in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 47, you have overwhelming success after success after success after success. Saul cannot be stopped. And whereas Solomon is known as being the one who expands the empire possibly to its greatest limits, that the nation of Israel would not see more physical territory under anybody besides Solomon. And David gets a lot of credit for being the glorious King David who sits on the throne, who restores it, who turns it into a proper monarchy. Saul is the one right here at the beginning who takes this ragtag group of confederations, or this confederation of different tribes, and leads them more or less in guerrilla-style warfare against the Philistines, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, all the other ites in the world that dared threaten the people of God. And we can't miss this early story of Saul. Because what it teaches us more than anything about, regardless about how Saul would eventually live his life, is that the greatest success comes as a team and not as individuals. One of my favorite characters, obviously, I think it's everybody's favorite character in the New Testament, is that of Paul. Paul is a derivative from Saul, we understand that, but Paul in the New Testament is the hero of the book of Acts next to Jesus himself. There's nobody who gets more airtime, there's nobody who gets more conversation, storyline. And when we look at Acts and we think this is a person who possessed enormous feats, who commanded enormous respect. And yet everywhere you see Paul, you see Silas. You see Barnabas. You see Epaphroditus. You see Philemon. You see Onesimus. You see people right alongside him. And that's why when you get to Romans 15, literally it's a list of shout-outs of Paul saying, tell this guy hi, tell this guy hi, tell this girl hey, tell this person hi. And why 2 Timothy 4, as he's describing his departure from this physical world, he talks about all the people that he loves, a couple people that he doesn't love so much, and then he talks about the glory that awaits not only him, but also everybody. Paul did not do it alone. And in Saul's glory years, this early period of when he was a king, in chapter 11 down to chapter 13, verse 8, this is the glory years of Saul. And he accomplishes these things not on his own back, but on the backs of people that he trusted with his countrymen, but most importantly, with God. Saul would eventually forget this. And as Saul sees David more and more as a threat, and he begins to see God and God more as an enemy instead of as a friend, that's when you see the personality of Saul begin to change. That's where you begin to see the personality of Saul shift from somebody who commands respect, who loves other people, who is out there trying to help Jabesh Gilead, all these different people, to somebody who only exists for the purpose of bettering themselves. And then you have this middle period. And this is where you begin to see the wheels start to go off. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting in verse 8, look at that if you would. Flip a couple chapters further. The Old Testament text is very deliberate in that it lays out three distinct events in the life of Saul that begin to shape his downfall. I tried to find the crown, by the way, that went up and then sharply down, but they don't really make crowns like that, so this will have to do for now. But imagine, if you will, from this point forward, a very sharp and very fast downfall. Because from 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8 forward, that's essentially what you have. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 8, this is after Saul understands that he's supposed to wait for Samuel to come forth to bring the sacrifices before he enters into battle. But as 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 8 mentions, it says, now Saul waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal. But more importantly, the people were scattering from him. So Saul, and you can insert the phrase, in a moment of panic, said, bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he finished offering, isn't that always how it goes? As soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and said to him, or to greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, because I saw the people were scattering from me, that you did not come within the appointed days, that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me. Gilgal, I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Now, whether or not Saul actually forced himself to offer the burnt offering has been up for debate. There have been people that have speculated that this was Saul trying to concentrate power within himself. But regardless of how you phrase this event, the one thing that does stand out is the fact that Saul panicked. Because twice within Saul's own words, and once at the beginning of this passage, the phrase is mentioned that he begins to see the people scatter. And when he begins to see the people scatter, that's when he decides to himself, the 7 days have gone, Samuel didn't keep up his end of the deal, so I'm going to offer the sacrifices for him because somebody has to do it around here. So Saul doesn't, even though he knows he's not supposed to. And this first rebuke that Samuel gives to him is kind of a milder rebuke, especially in comparison to the one that you have in chapter 14. In chapter 14, after you have all these different successes, 1 Samuel chapter 14, starting in verse 43, you have Saul on a power trip. Saul wanting to pursue and kill the Philistines and go after them no matter what, no matter what, no matter what. And Saul makes a rash vow in 1 Samuel chapter 14 that he shouldn't have made. And he claims that anybody who eats anything before we find these people, I'm going to put them to death. And as the text bears out, the one person who ate something was his son Jonathan. The one person, the one bright light in Saul's life from beginning to end, Jonathan, is the one who eats of this. And in 1 Samuel chapter 14, starting verse 43, Saul says to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." Jonathan told him and said, "I indeed tasted a little honey with the end of my staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I must die." Notice Jonathan's courage. Verse 44, Saul said, "May God do this to me and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." Notice the interplay here. Because not only is Jonathan willing to accept his punishment that he knows is right, Saul is willing to dole it out to his own son. But something happens in verse 45. The people then said to Saul, "Must Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel?" Far from it. Because as the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Do you notice the shift that takes place here? Because in 1 Samuel chapter 11 down through chapter 13, what you have is this amazing concentration of power, this amazing love and devotion that people have towards Saul. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 14, because of Saul's foolish mistakes and his foolish decisions, that is almost flipped. And now people are gravitating towards Jonathan because they love him and they're rescuing him from the hand of Saul. You see people begin to crack a little bit in their love and their devotion to Saul. That maybe he's not the leader that we thought he was. Maybe he's not the one who makes these wise decisions. Maybe he's not the one that possesses the wisdom that we need to have in the first place. And then you go to chapter 15. This is where you have the instance with the Amalekites. Starting in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 15, it says, "Samuel said to Saul, 'The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over this people over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. Do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, both child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey.' And then Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the valley. Saul came to the Kenites and said, 'Go, depart, go down from among the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up from Egypt.' So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. Saul then defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. But he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword." Verse 9, "But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the ox, and the fatlings of the lamb, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly." Here's the key phrase in this entire thing in verse 9. "But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed." What you see starting in chapter 13, moving into chapter 14, and moving into chapter 15, is this faith that begins to crumble. And you see Saul's faith in God begin to shatter a little bit here when in chapter 13, he begins to be a little hesitant about Samuel's interaction. He begins to panic about the people that are leaving. And then in chapter 14, he begins to take so much pride in his own actions that he almost costs his son his life, makes that rash vow. But it's here in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel that you begin to see the full carnality of Saul's attitude when he looks at the Amalekites, and he has no problem destroying people. He has no problem destroying animals. All the things that he deems worthless in his life. But he keeps Agag. He keeps the things that matter, quote unquote, in this world. And I believe this is deliberately interplayed when you get to chapter 15 or when you get to chapter 16 and 17, where Samuel then shows up at David's doorstep, and David is despised not only by his own father, but in a way kind of like Samuel. Samuel just assumes that the best are here, there's nobody else left. And this thing that was despised and worthless, that Saul has no problem annihilating. David is kind of a type of those things that are worthless, those things that are cast aside, those things that are shameful. You begin to see Saul's armor start to crumble. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, as Saul begins to kind of turn out from God, and God pulls the kingdom back from that very violent tearing of his robe, there's one passage in chapter 16 that kind of typifies this. Chapter 16, starting in verse 13. Listen to this exchange right here, these two verses. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and in verse 13. It says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil, this is now about David, and anointed David in the midst of his brother, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. We just saw that about Saul. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now listen to this, verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord then departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord arose. David is very clear, and the scriptures are very clear in this instance, who David is going to become and who Saul is not going to become. As a result of them tearing the kingdom, that very violent, vivid description where he tears a part of Samuel's garment, and Samuel says, Thus is the kingdom going to be torn to you. You see it in 1 Samuel 16, 13, 14, where the Spirit comes upon David and it leaves Saul. And David is now presented as the person who is everything that Saul is not. And this is the reason, in my opinion, why Saul is so hateful towards David. Because David represents everything that Saul should have been. David loves God. Saul should have loved God. David was strong. He was courageous. Saul should have kept being strong and courageous. David is energetic. He's a great leader. Saul should have kept being energetic and a great leader. But it shifts from time to time. We need to remember always, whenever we talk about this, that we can never, for any reason, let our emotions get in the way of our service to God. And you think when Saul has the Amalekites right in front of him, he begins to conceptualize them as good and as bad. These are things that are valuable, these are things that are not valuable. Even though God has said all of them are not valuable. I want you to destroy all of them. He begins to let his own process and his own thinking begin to get in the way of what he knows he should be doing. It's that immortal phrase whenever Naaman wants to be baptized, and he says, Behold, I thought. And that's in essence the same thing that we have in our own lives. The last chapter of Saul is by far the worst. But it's summed up in chapter 15 and verse 28. Flip back to that if you would. The last section of Saul's life is by far the worst, but it's summed up by this one. 1 Samuel chapter 15, this one verse that in my opinion sums up everything that follows from here on out. 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 28. It says, Samuel said to him, talking about Saul, or talking to Saul, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. We want to talk about the difference between David and Saul all day long. We can talk about how Saul was heads and shoulders above everybody, and how he was handsome, and how he was a great warrior, and how he was a fantastic leader, and he was a uniter of the tribes. But at the end of the day, David was everything that Saul was not. And David, quite frankly, was just better than him. Not because he was more handsome, not because he was a better warrior, not because he was necessarily a better leader, although he make your argument for at least two of those things. But because David walked with God. And because David had a heart that was the same as God's. And God was looking for, if you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8, what God told the people is, you don't want me as king anymore? That's fine. I'll give you Saul. But David was the closest human thing that they were going to get to God in a king on this earth. And David wasn't perfect. David went off and had several different errors. We talked about one of them this morning. David had all sorts of his different errors and his sins and his discrepancies. But at the end of the day, David always sought after what was right. And that's the important thing. People have speculated about why Saul shifts so suddenly right in the middle here of 1 Samuel. And there have been people that have speculated maybe there's two writers of Samuel. There's a pro-Saul writer and there's an anti-Saul writer. And the first half of Samuel is written by the pro-Saul writer. The second half is written by a writer that just hated Saul. That's why you have the split personality. There have been people that have speculated maybe Saul developed a brain tumor at some point, and that's why his personality so shifts. There are some suggest that he suffers from depression, PTSD, something along those lines. But regardless of where you want to slice it, no matter what happens, no matter how you want to explain it, the simple explanation boils down to 1 Samuel 15, verse 28. David was just better than Saul. Not because he was more handsome. Not because he was a better warrior. Not because he was a better leader. But because he put his heart towards God. And that made him perfect. In the end, the only thing that Saul really suffered for him is just plain old jealousy. And it's very akin to a story that we read elsewhere. Look in Genesis, the 4th chapter. Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? Why is your countenance falling? Listen to this advice here in verse 7. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desires for you, but you must master it." Verse 8, Cain didn't master it. Because he talked to Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. I have looked at this passage mainly because I am a little brother, but I have looked at this passage on several different occasions and wondered to myself, why did Cain kill Abel? Of anything, don't do that. And the reason, in my opinion, and you can take this $1.50 will buy you a Coke. It used to be $1.25, but thanks to inflation. When you look at Cain's Abel's story and you look at Saul and David's story, there's so many parallels. And the reason that Cain killed Abel was because Abel was everything towards God that Cain was not. Abel was humble. He was righteous. He offered, from all we can tell, everything that God wanted him to offer, nothing that he didn't. But Cain, for whatever reason, thought that his sacrifice was going to be better. And he thought that by neutralizing Abel, he could at least restore some of the pain that he had by being turned away from God. That's the same situation with Saul and David. Saul sees David. David is ascending the throne, and David becomes the great king. David has slain his thousands, or Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000 just seems to be better. Saul is consumed with jealousy because David represents everything that Saul is not. And Saul could be, but he chose not to for whatever reason. You see this, for lack of a better phrase, this schizophrenic attitude within Saul from this point forward, because in chapter 18 you have him throwing a spear at David, and then in chapter 19 you have him anointing him as a commander in one of his armies. Saul has no idea what to do with David, just like Cain has no idea what to do with Abel. And because of that, we learn from this the lesson. It's not really how you start, ladies and gentlemen. It's how you finish. No one would make the argument, and hopefully you can't make the argument after this morning, that Saul was anything less than amazing in his early part of his reign. But throughout the course of his life, he let his emotions, he let his anger, he let his jealousy, he let his spitefulness, he let his selfishness, he let his passion get so far consumed he didn't know what to do. And then you have the witch of Endor consulting a medium that he should have never gone to. And then him committing suicide at the top of Mount Gilboa 42 years after he ascends the throne. What a sad story Saul is over the course of his life. Because Saul could have been, for so many reasons, could have been someone great. But he chose not to. As we mentioned earlier, it's very easy for us sometimes when we look at David and Saul to align ourselves with one and the other. And I'm not going to do a straw poll, because I don't want to see it necessarily. But if I were to do a poll, I would imagine most of us this morning would align ourselves with David. Most of us would say as we look in the story, well, I'm more like David than I am like Saul. Because David had some errors, he made some mistakes, but he was good. He was good. Saul was not. When you look at their lives kind of on a plane, and you take away the God factor in them, their lives physically are very similar to each other. The one difference between the two men, the reason that we so oftentimes associate our lives with David instead of Saul, is the same reason that we associate our lives with Peter and not Judas. Because David's story ends well, and Saul's doesn't. Judas' story does not end well, and Peter's does. But when you look at the similarities in their story, you look at the similarities in their character and their personalities and what they did, there's some discrepancies. There's some huge discrepancies in Peter and Judas's. But the one big thing is they sought the thing, that only thing that could give them repentance. And the only thing that could give them forgiveness. Through an act of humility. As we approach our lives and as we look at the things that we do wrong in this world, it can be very easy for us to be so consumed by guilt, so consumed by the emotions of this world, that in our rage we seek to alleviate the thing that shows us our problems and not the problem itself. And that's what Saul did. Saul wanted to kill David, not because David was a threat really to him, but because David highlighted his worst failures in life. Let us never be like Saul to seek to assassinate something or somebody rather than fixing the problem that we need to take care of in our lives. If we can help you with that anyway, won't you come as we stand?
In heavenly armor we'll enter the land. The battle belongs to the Lord. No weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord.